Hello, everyone. Welcome to this new meeting of the Finance Network series titled In Conversation, Exploring the Philosophy of Money and Finance. And today we are very delighted and honored to welcome Donald MacKenzie. Donald is professor of sociology at the University of Edinburgh and is one of the most influential figures in the interdisciplinary field known as the social study of finance. And his work has profoundly shaped how we understand the relationship between economic theory, financial technologies, and market behavior. With a background in both sociology and history and philosophy of science, Donald is best known for his groundbreaking book, An Engine, Not a Camera, published in 2006 by the MIT Press, where he explored the idea that financial models do not merely describe markets, but actively shape and construct them, a thesis that helped define what is now widely known as the performative turn in economics and finance. From a philosophical standpoint, his theory is particularly compelling because it illustrates how and why epistemic devices carry ontological force, showing that epistemic functions of theories and models cannot be disentangled from their ontological effects. So theory and models help bring into being the market structure they were thought to merely describe. Over the past 2 decades, Donald's research has explored how algorithmic trading, risk models, and derivative markets evolved through complex interaction between actors, institutions, and mathematical formalisms. And these empirical and theoretical contributions have bridged gaps between sociology, economics, science and technology studies, philosophy and finance, and a recipient of numerous awards and honors, Donald continues to be at the forefront of debates about the role of knowledge, models, and ethics in financial system, and his work remains essential reading for scholars interested in how abstract economic ideas take material and institutional form in real-world markets. This interview marks the 20th anniversary of his book, An Engine, Not a Camera, and offers an opportunity to reflect on his legacy, its theoretical implication, and its relevance for today's evolving financial setting. So, Donald, thank you again for accepting our invitation. And I'll begin the interview with a foundational and retrospective question. And the question is, how did your background in the history and sociology of science and technology shape the way you approached financial markets as objects of sociological inquiry?
Well, thank you, Emiliano, and thank you for that very sort of generous and flattering introduction. That's great of you, and thank you for the opportunity to talk in your series. I suppose there are 2 things to say in answer to your question. I mean, the first is that, of course, if you have a background in the sociology of science and technology, you're particularly on the lookout for aspects of any social phenomenon that have a kind of scientific, technical nature. So when I started getting interested in finance was the late 1990s, and of course what I could have done is focus on the dot-com bubble that was going on, and of course a bubble is a social phenomenon, but I thought to myself, well, that's interesting. It was partly I simply didn't want to spend lots of time on computerized discussion for watching what other people were posting about the shares of Microsoft or things like that. So I thought that's not really what interested me about finance. And then the second aspect of it, and this is a very particular connection, that my PhD supervisor was the sociologist of science and social theorist Barry Barnes. And Barnes has always been interested in what you might call the self-referring and self-validating aspects of social knowledge. So just by chance, I happened to read Peter Bernstein's book, Against the Gods, which much of it I didn't like tremendously because it was history of statistics and probability theory of a fairly well-known kind, but it ended with 5 chapters on modern financial theory and its practical uses. So here I could see, here's a case where knowledge, financial theory, is being used by participants in market processes. So that was really the germ of the idea that took me eventually to an engine, not a camera.
Thank you very much, Donald. And now my second question, of course, is about the notion of performativity. And so it's a kind of ontological question. So what is performativity, and what definition will you employ after 2 decades working on it?
Well, Emiliano, I don't think I can improve on the definition that you gave 3 or 4 minutes ago. I guess when I have to explain it to people, I would say, first of all, that performativity refers to a representation that has effects on what is being represented. And specifically when one's talking about economics and the performativity of economics, that economics doesn't always simply stand outside of markets, outside of economic activity, viewing them from a distance, so to speak, that economics is often employed by participants in economic processes, and specifically in markets. Mathematical models of markets are employed by traders and other kind of participants in financial markets, and that's really the empirical domain of performativity that interests me.
Wonderful. And in addition to performativity, what other aspects of financial markets most struck you in the research for an engine, not a camera?
Well, I will actually have the indulgence of being a little bit autobiographical here, and just tell you very briefly about a kind of crucial moment in the research, because a lot of what the book is about is things going on in the derivatives markets in Chicago. And when I started the research, I knew absolutely nobody in the derivatives markets. So my first thought was, well, I knew that the Chicago Board of Trade had set up an options exchange in 1973, and the Board of Trade is one of those venerable institutions that actually has an archive. So I thought, well, I'll go to Chicago and ask to see the bit of the archive dealing with the establishment of the Chicago Board Options Exchange. So I set off for Chicago, booked into the cheapest hotel I could find in downtown Chicago, which was the Blackstone Hotel on Michigan Avenue. And when I arrived there, and this is 1999, so this wasn't an email, this was a note that had been left at reception for me from the reception, from the archivist of the Chicago Board of Trade, which said, sorry, all access denied. I suggest that you phone Emily Schmitz on, and then there was a telephone number. Now, I had absolutely no idea who Emily Schmitz was, but then I suddenly had several days in Chicago with nothing to do, so I thought, okay, I will phone up. And who she turned out to be, at that point she was a compliance officer for the Chicago Board Options Exchange, but she'd started as the secretary to a man called Joe Sullivan, who was the leading figure in the establishment of the exchange. And she was the kind of person who just kept in touch with people, who knew all their private telephone numbers and so on. So she introduced me to traders on the Chicago Board Options Exchange, and she was the most important entry point that I had to Chicago's open outcry trading pits, sort of semicircular amphitheaters with sometimes hundreds of traders, sometimes shouting, screaming, jostling, hand signaling prices. It was astonishing, and in those that 1999, the pits were still in full flow. I mean, then nowadays there are hardly any open outcry pits left, and the ones that you can see are sort of pale echoes of what they used to be. So that almost visceral experience, certainly was a visceral experience for traders in those pits, and a bit of a visceral experience for me seeing it going on. That was perhaps the single thing that is most struck me, and I count it as one of the great privileges of my life that just by accident I was able to see that unique form of human interaction, open outcry trading, when it still flourished.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And my next question, of course, is about the book and your work on performativity. And what are the critics that you benefited the most from? And on the other side, what are the suggestions that helped you the most?
Yeah. No, I think there's several people that would deserve mention there, but I'll probably just concentrate on two. I mean, I would also, for example, mention Phil Morawski, whose stringent critiques I've always found useful. But the two that I wanted briefly to concentrate on is, first of all, Emmanuel Didier, the French scholar, who enabled me, I hope successfully, to correct a misunderstanding that I had quite unthinkingly provoked. Because, of course, if you use the notion of performativity, and I did actually decide to switch from Barry Barnes's conceptual framework to the notion of performativity as a sort of simpler way of talking about the phenomena that interests me. It's performativity is of course coined by J.L. Austin, and I don't need to tell the people watching on your channel that he was a linguistic philosopher, and I realized from Didier's critique that I was at risk of appearing to make a claim in linguistic philosophy, which had never for a moment been my intention, and that therefore what I wasn't doing, and this is what he prompted me implicitly to correct, I wasn't emphasizing enough the materiality of the uses of models in finance, and very specifically in the open outcry trading pits, the use of paper sheets of theoretical option prices sold to traders by Fisher Black, the Black of the Black-Scholes option pricing model. In those days, you weren't allowed to take a computer onto the floor of the options exchange, and in any case, it would have been a clunky thing to do. You could take a calculator, but with the calculators of those days, getting a solution to the Black-Scholes equation out from a calculator in the middle of all the jostling hassle of bodies really wasn't very attractive. So what people used to do was to roll black sheets as paper sheets into tight cylinders so they could grasp them in the palm of their hands with just only the relevant rows visible and carry them onto the trading floor. And that was actually a significant material aspect of how the Black-Scholes model was used in Chicago, and it was really Emmanuel's critique that prompted me to emphasize more strongly those sort of aspects of performativity. And then I think the other critique, I mean, it's not a critique of me in particular, but it's the work of Fabian Muniesa, in particular in his book, The Provoked Economy, where he very usefully takes the notion of performativity and embeds it in theoretical and philosophical traditions that weren't part of my intellectual formation at all. It's Deleuze, it's pragmatist philosophy and the like, and that involves a broader notion of performativity, and that's also been very useful to me. I must admit I haven't fully followed Fabian in that direction, but having that direction sketched out is a great contribution.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And we now move to a related question. What is the part of your theory you think is or was most misunderstood?
I think two things. First of all, and I'm sure there were some formulations that make this my own fault. It was read as the effects of economic theory on markets. And first of all, I mean, and this is something that Michel Canon is clear about, that when he talks about performativity, economics doesn't just mean what professors of economics write and teach and do. The economic practices, marketing, accounting, and so on are part of his notion of economics. So that's one level of misinterpretation. But the specific misinterpretation is because I was actually talking about what professional economists did. Is that it's very easy because we live in history of ideas is part of what you do, or part of what many people do. It's very easy to think about economics as theory, as as concepts and so on, and set aside all the other aspects of economic practice that are also important. So I think those two, the overly narrow reading of economics and the over emphasis on the influence of theory. Those are probably the two things I would point to.
Wonderful. And were there particular empirical cases or moments, perhaps in derivatives of algorithmic trading, where you felt the performative framework was especially tested or challenged?
Yes and no, I think, is the answer to that. Yes, in the sense that fairly soon after my book was published, the world was, of course, hit by the global financial crisis, beginning in 2007 and coming to its ghastly peak in the autumn of 2008. And it was kind of natural for me to think about, well, what was the role of economic modelling in that? And of course, as we all now know, so this wasn't quite as clear, I think, as to begin with, to people who weren't specialists in the area, that the very core of the crisis was in collateralized debt obligations based upon asset-backed securities, specifically mortgage-backed securities. And there was a dominant model of collateralized debt obligations, the so-called Gaussian copula model. And it would have been easy for me to fall into thinking that that's really just Black-Scholes. It's the Black-Scholes story again. And it really isn't. I started interviewing specialists in collateralized debt obligations actually before the crisis hit. And it was clear that even then, they really didn't like the model. It wasn't like Black-Scholes, because at the core of Black-Scholes there is the very clear arbitrage mechanism that is part of the derivation of the model and also part of practice, the part of practice in derivatives markets. The Gaussian copula really wasn't mobilized like that. It wasn't theory, so to speak. No respectable economist would have regarded the Gaussian copula as a piece of economic theory. People would refer to it as just curve fitting. But that didn't, of course, mean that it wasn't very influential. And among the things that interested me as well, why did people keep using a formula that in a certain sense they didn't believe in? And part of the answer was because everybody else was using it, even though they didn't believe in it either. But it had become the market standard, so to speak, and for all sorts of organizational reasons. It can be hard to depart from the market standard, because if you start valuing your trading positions by a different model, then your risk department is going to say, wait, hey, hold on a moment now. You're valuing your positions by this thing that you've thought up. Why on earth are you not using the standard model to value your positions? So the kind of mechanisms involved were very different from those involved in the case of the Black-Scholes model. But I said yes and no, and then the no is important too, because I've always been interested not just in performativity, but in counter-performativity, in the processes by which, and I'm going to say this rather kind of crudely, so to speak, the processes by which, instead of the application of an aspect of economics changing realities towards the postulates of the model, it can be that the use of a model can actually change financial markets to move them away from the postulates of the model. And there's counter-performativity in the Black-Scholes story when you get to the 1987 stock market crash, and there was a great deal of counter-performativity in 2007, 2008 in terms of the effects of models on the financial market. So that theme of counter-performativity did run through the two cases.
Very interesting. And now, we try to look at the future. So my question is, are there new areas where you think the notions of performativity might be helpful?
Yeah, I think there are lots. And that's where I think I would refer back to Fabien Munyeza's book. I mean, it's quite an old book now, 2014 or so. And there's actually a very nice review of it by Jose Osandon from Copenhagen, who I think you may have had in various of your seminars. And it's a wide range. It's a short book and a wide-ranging book. And it talks about things that are as different as the effects of the Harvard Business School case study method to the conventions in the measurements of state budgets and the like. And in a certain sense, to put it simplistically, the book is about the framing of economic reality by knowledge. And if you think about it like that, there is an endless sort of terrain, because knowledge is completely interwoven with economic processes. Fabien's book is one of those books where it's a short book, and there's a lot to be said for short books. But whenever you read one of the empirical chapters, you think, oh, I wish he'd said more about this. So it's a good book to start with, to see, first of all, how important that issue, the relationship between knowledge and economic processes, is, and the richness of the empirical terrain that could be developed. And of course, a lot of people have been doing work of this kind. So this is not that this is not a tabula rasa, but there's still a lot more that could be done.
Okay, so the next question is quite natural. So what is the future of performativity, and what can be done in the future in this sense?
Yeah, I think two things. I mean, one is that in a sense that the more general notion of performativity that you find in Munyeza's work, and other people's work as well, can certainly be applied. It would also, I think so, be good if people can find other cases of what, it's a bit self-derogatory to say this, of the narrow interpretation of performativity that I gave in 2006, but there is a sense in which it was narrow. In other words, that interpretation being the effects of the use of financial models on patterns of market prices. There's been less done on that topic than I would have hoped. And in part, I think it's because it's a kind of hard thing to do, and in a certain sense, I got lucky in two ways in the case of the Black-Scholes model. First of all, because it was the single dominant model of option pricing. There were alternatives, but Black-Scholes was very widely used. And the trouble with situations where you have more than one model in play, determining the effects of those models on patterns of market prices becomes a very complicated kind of thing. And the other way in which I got lucky is quite simply that there were very good econometric tests of the Black-Scholes model, particularly those done by the Berkeley financial economist Mark Rubinstein. And those enabled me to talk about patterns of market prices without myself having to become a financial econometrician to analyze it. And other cases, people might have to do their own econometric work, and that also makes it a difficult thing to do. So I think there's more that could be done, but I can actually understand why there's been less work of that kind than I would have hoped for.
Okay, yeah, I see the point. And my next question is about materiality. So,
yeah,
to what extent do you think the performativity of finance depends on the material infrastructure of markets, such as code, cables, data center, and so on?
Yeah, no, I mean it clearly does, and as I say, that's where I was crediting Emmanuel Didier's critique of making me realize I hadn't said enough about that. And yes, the material aspects of financial markets are always important. It's another memory actually from those Chicago years. There's on the screens around the pits of the Chicago Board Options Exchange, the electronic display screens, they actually contained theoretical option pricing. It wasn't, strictly speaking, Black-Scholes. It was what's called the Cox-Ross-Rubinstein model, of which Black-Scholes is a kind of limit case. So you could stand as a trader in that pit, and you didn't. I don't think Black was selling his sheets. In fact, Black was dead by the time I came to Chicago. But I think the service had stopped fairly soon. You could stand in those pits and just look up the way, and there were model informed prices on the screens. So that was a simple, mundane aspect of the importance of materiality. The whole area of high frequency trading. I mean, we don't really have time, I think, to get into high frequency trading and the extreme automation and the extremely fast automation that involves. But there is a certain sense in which there are actually quite simple models of financial markets embedded in high frequency trading algorithms, and the speed that you need to operate with to make profitable use of those models is such that a human being simply cannot do it, that it has to be implemented by an algorithm.
That's interesting. And now we change a bit the focus of the interview, and we move to ethics, power, and politics. And so
Yeah.
my next question is, in what ways has your work intersected with question of ethics, particularly regarding the unintended consequences of model-driven markets?
Yeah. Just in the same way as I'm not a linguistic philosopher, I'm not, of course, a moral philosopher either. So I'm always wary of using a term like ethics because I know I'm not, in any sense, a specialist in it. But if you broaden, if you broaden the notion of ethics to sort of questions of governance and regulation, the sort of implications that you can draw out concern how unwise it is for regulators to formulate regulations that de facto incentivize the use of one particular model or narrow set of models, because certainly in terms of banking regulation, I think it did happen in the late 1990s into the 2000s, that there was de facto pressure from regulators to use value at risk models, which were very much a common class of models. And the trouble is, of course, if everyone in the market is using the same model, then there's quite a high danger that everyone will want to do the same thing at the same time. If the model is showing that your position, the risk of your positions is going up, then you're going to want to reduce those positions. But everyone trying to reduce their positions at the same time can create spirals in prices. I mean, that was in essence the process that brought down the hedge fund long-term capital management in 1998, which was it's one of those events that, by comparison with 2008, it wasn't that serious, but it was one of those canary in the coal mine warnings that we perhaps should have paid greater attention to. So I'd say those kind of things. I mean, I'm not sure whether I'd want to use the term ethics with a capital E to describe them, but certainly there's issues of prudence in terms of regulation there. The other thing I would say about questions of ethics, again, not using it with a capital E, kind of with a capital E on it, is it a piece of work that's resonated with me because it does rather fit the kind of phenomena that I've encountered in doing the research that I've done. Not the aspects of it that deal in any direct sense with performativity, just the more general aspects of it. The piece of work that resonates is Thomas Philippon's work on the efficiency of US financial markets, where essentially the efficiency is the measure of the cost. The measure of efficiency is the relationship between the amounts of financial intermediation and the costs of those financial intermediation. And the very striking, puzzling phenomenon that Philippon suggests, that in that sense of efficiency, financial markets have not become more efficient through time, that the intermediaries still manage to capture a healthy amount of the flow of money going through those markets. And some aspects become more efficient, like the reduction in the fees of index funds. Other aspects, such as the use of hedge funds and private equity with their much higher levels of fees, seemed, at least in Philippon's analysis, to sort of kind of as it were balance each other out. And in that very simple sense, finance is a vehicle of inequality, because it means that the insiders to the financial system get richer. And inequality is, of course, an ethical issue. And sometimes I get a little bit frustrated by people with my kind of intellectual formation researching financial markets and not looking at those grubby things, so to speak, not looking enough at what I sometimes call the mundane political economy of finance. In other words, not the making or losing of giant sums of money all at once, but the making of small amounts of money time and time and time again, so that they accumulate to a significant contribution to socioeconomic inequality.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And so my next question is tied to your last answer. So do you think that performativity has also political implication that have not yet been fully explored, perhaps in the realm of inequality, access, or epistemic justice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's clear that some aspects of financial economics, and I think very specifically the efficient markets hypothesis, have played legitimatory roles in policy changes that have had, in many respects, undesirable consequences. And it's going to be interesting to follow. I mean, I'm not followed in any detail the new stuff on the illiquid markets hypothesis, which is in a certain sense, a foundational critique of, interestingly, also coming out of Chicago with the foundational critique of classic financial efficient markets theories. And so I think it is important to focus on the legitimatory use of knowledge. And one of the interviews that's most stuck in my mind from An Engine Not a Camera is an interview with the counsel, the lawyer of the Chicago Board Options Exchange. And what he said to me was that in his view, the contribution of Black-Scholes to the success of the Chicago Board Options Exchange wasn't anything to do with pricing or hedging or risk management. It was to do with the fact that when they were trying to get the exchange set up, regulators associated options with market manipulation and gambling. Options had been heavily involved in the famous market manipulations that led to the great crash of 1929. And this man, Burton Risman was his name, said to me that in his view, the contribution of Black-Scholes was to say, this is not gambling, this is efficient pricing. So that legitimatory role, in his view, was crucial. So I think we should always keep in mind that quite apart from all its instrumental uses in financial markets, that economics can play a legitimatory role.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And can the performativity lens help us understand how certain actors, for instance, rating agencies, central banks, exert a kind of epistemic power in global finance?
Well, I think so, yes. I mean, and indeed, people who have studied central banking indeed have pointed that out. I mean, I've never myself looked at central banking, so all of this is secondhand. But there's a certain sense in which, if you are a senior central banker, you know that your words have power, so to speak. So you choose your words very carefully, and often you are deliberately seeking a performative effect. So certainly, yes, I think that the answer to your question is, if you're looking at something like central banking, then performativity is a natural lens through which to look at it.
Yeah, thank you. And we had an example with Draghi here in Europe.
Yeah. Whatever it takes.
Yeah. So we now move to the last part of our this wonderful conversation, and looking at contemporary developments and frontiers. And so my question is, do new developments of high frequency and algorithmic trading alter the way we should think about performativity?
I think actually I'd want to push your question onto a slightly different terrain, which is the terrain of my current research, which I'm only just getting started on, which is to do with artificial intelligence and large language models. And very specifically, one of the themes I'm interested in is the scaling laws of artificial intelligence, where there's a lot of complication and we're close to the end. So I'll just give the simplest formulation, which comes from Sam Altman of OpenAI, where he says that the intelligence of a system is the log of the amount of resources used to train the system, and also the resources used at inference time, you know, when there is a prompt. So it's the training compute, the amount of training data, and inference compute. And what he calls the intelligence of the system is the logarithm of this is that. You can already tell this is, you know, this comes from a blog post. This is not an equation, so it's a vaguish statement that the intelligence system is the logarithm of the resources employed. And that's really interesting, because of course what he is doing there is emphasizing that it's a monotonic function. That's to say, the more money you throw at AI, at those resources, then the better the results you get. But again, I think with an audience like yours, I don't need to remind people that a logarithmic function, at least you know, of the kind that's relevant here, is a diminishing returns function. The scaling laws, I think, have been important in one of the biggest things that's going on in the economic world currently, which is the vast amount, the trillions of dollars that are being spent on AI infrastructure. But if memory serves me right, Citigroup predicting that between now and 2030, $7.8 trillion of investment is going into AI. The US defense budget is just $1 trillion a year. So there's more money than the entirety of the US defense budget is likely to be spent. And there's this kind of mathematical thing, the scaling laws, that are at the heart of this. And I'm only just beginning the research, and yeah, I don't know whether it's like the Gaussian copula, that nobody really believes in the scaling laws, but they think everybody else believes in them. So they have to orient their actions to them. So you can see there's an issue of performativity there. We've got a piece of knowledge, and once again, a mathematical piece of knowledge that's implicated in real-world processes that are of enormous political, economic, and indeed environmental, because all these chips, all these data centers consume electricity. So that's the kind of way I would, I would say that questions of performativity bear upon the current political economic landscape.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you. It's and so the natural last question of this interview is about new generations. And so, how do you think young researchers in sociology, philosophy, and social and technology studies, science should approach finance today, and what are the blind spots or the open doors they should pursue?
Yeah. Well, I've already mentioned what I think is a bit of a blind spot, which is the issue I call mundane political economy, and the routine money making in finance, and specifically the routine money making in the form of fees. And those things are always important. I didn't myself give them enough emphasis. I mean, they were there in the Chicago pits, but I didn't give them enough emphasis in my own work, partly because issues of the kind we've been discussing were at the forefront of my mind, and partly just because this was so exotic, this world of shouting, screaming, jostling, gesticulating people, and that those issues, those mundane issues, seem mundane in the ordinary kind of sense. So it's important to bear that in mind. The other thing I would say, and this very much loops back to the fact that I am by background a sociologist of science and technology, is the importance of opening up opaque boxes, because our world is full of things that only insiders understand, that only engineers, for example, understand, and it can be a little bit seductively easy to sort of set those aside when you're doing work of a sociological kind on financial markets. And the sociologist of science in me always wants to say, well, there's something that's playing this box. Let's, for simplicity, just call it a box, even though it's in many cases not literally a box. There's this box that's playing a crucial role. Let's see what's inside it. And if you do that quite often, you find really quite interesting things.
Thank you very much, Donald. That's probably the best way of ending this interview. And I thank you one more time very much for your time and your kindness. And of course, I hope to see you soon on the Financial Science seminars.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much once again. And I will just say, as I said at the very beginning, this has been great of you to pay this attention to what I've done over the years, and I very much enjoyed your conversation. So very good to speak to you.